a vanished ledger, a murdered magnate, and a secret inked in crimson silk. Welcome to Cipher Trails. Where in the world are you tuning in from, dear listener? Your presence here means more than you know. Let us now descend into the shadows of Baker Street. It was on one of those leaden January afternoons, when the London fog rolled off the river like a heavy shroud, that the case that would come to be known as the Riddle of the Crimson Silk Ledger first crossed our threshold. I remember it well, for Holmes had been particularly restless that week, his violin strings worn thin, his monographs untouched, and his mind starved for stimulation. We were seated by the fire in our lodgings at Baker Street, the gaslight flickering against the frost-laced window panes, when Mrs. Hudson announced the arrival of a visitor. The gentleman who entered was of medium build, with a neatly trimmed beard and anxious grey eyes. He wore a damp overcoat of good quality and clutched a crushed bowler hat in his gloved hands. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice quivering with tension, "but I have come about a death. One that the police are eager to call an accident." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his steepled fingers resting beneath his chin. "Pray be seated, Mr. Quarles. Tobias Quarles. I am a clerk to Mr. Horatio Ashcroft, who operated the Ashcroft Shipping Company out of a warehouse on the Thames near Whitechapel." "And death?" "Mr. Ashcroft himself, sir. Found yesterday morning by the dockside watchman, face down in the freezing mud below Ashcroft Wharf. The constable on duty declared it a misstep. He had been walking home alone the previous night, and it was assumed he slipped in the dark." "A convenient conclusion," Holmes murmured, rising to light his pipe. "And yet you appear unconvinced." Quarles leaned forward. "Because, Mr. Holmes, Ashcroft never walked that route. He took his carriage from the warehouse to his residence in Hampstead without exception. What's more—" He paused, glancing over at me as if unsure whether to continue. "Please," I said reassuringly. "You may speak freely in front of Dr. Watson." "Well," said Quarles, "the watchman, Reuben Glass, swears he saw Ashcroft at 11 o'clock, an hour after the office usually closed, standing alone in the warehouse doorway with a red book in hand. Peculiar object, because no ledgers or count books in the office matched the description." Holmes exhaled a thin ribbon of smoke and turned to me. "Do you recall, Watson, the peculiar case of the stained logbook from the Calcutta Exchange?" "Of course," I replied, "an innocent mistake that nearly concealed the largest insurance fraud on the Bengal coast." "Precisely," said Holmes. "Mr. Quarles, your employer's death warrants closer scrutiny." Quarles brightened. "Then you'll take the case?" Holmes moved to the window, peering into the mist. "A wealthy shipping magnate dies on the docks he owns, carrying a mysterious crimson ledger that vanishes by morning. Scotland Yard calls it a slip and fall, and you, a loyal clerk, suspect foul play." He turned back with a faint smile. "Yes, Mr. Quarles? I believe Dr. Watson and I shall pay a visit to Ashcroft Wharf tomorrow." Thus began a case that would plunge us into the shadowy corridors of riverfront trade, unravel secrets inked in silk, and expose a deception so meticulous it had eluded every eye, save, of course, Holmes's. The following morning dawned with a slate-colored sky and a brittle chill that made the very gas lamps along the Thames appear to shiver in their brackets. London's fog had rolled in thick once again, draping the city in a dull veil of cold moisture that clung to every overcoat and gloved hand. Holmes, of course, seemed invigorated by the weather, pacing along the platform at Baker Street Station as we waited for the train that would take us eastward, his eyes bright beneath the brim of his hat. "Few things," he remarked, "are as instructive as a crime scene preserved by fog. The elements may conceal much from the eye, but they also slow the decay of clues, preserve footprints, scatter less of what matters. Even London's dreariness has its uses, Watson." "I only hope," I replied, pulling my scarf tighter, "that our walk along Ashcroft Wharf is brief and our answers swift. Docks in January are no place for leisurely examination." Holmes gave a soft chuckle but made no further reply. Our journey to Whitechapel was uneventful, and by 9:30 we stood before the iron gates of Ashcroft Wharf. A grim, imposing set of buildings stretched along the river bank. The primary warehouse, a tall brick structure with faded signage, bore the signs of long use. Rusted metal shutters, moss between the cobbles, and the distant clatter of carts echoing through the mist. Tobias Quarles met us at the entrance. He looked even wearier in daylight, with a face drawn from sleeplessness and a coat buttoned too hastily. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I'm grateful you came." "Have the police removed anything from the scene?" Holmes asked at once. "They examined the area briefly yesterday morning," Quarles replied, leading us across the wharf's uneven stones. "But as they deemed it accidental, no proper investigation was made. Constable Martin from the Whitechapel division took a few notes, then left. The warehouse was locked soon after." "And the body?" "Taken to the city mortuary just past noon," Quarles said. "I have a copy of the attending physician's report. Blunt force trauma to the head and a broken wrist, consistent with a fall. But Reuben Glass still swears he saw Mr. Ashcroft alive just before midnight, long after everyone else had gone." "Where is this Mr. Glass now?" "In the watchman's hut, sir. I told him to stay nearby this morning." "Excellent," Holmes said briskly. "We'll speak to him shortly. First, the doorway where Ashcroft was last seen. Show me." Quarles gestured to the northern side of the warehouse, where a small wooden canopy jutted out above a heavy rear door. The entrance was framed by crates stacked high, creating a dim corridor of sorts between the outer wall and the dock edge. The door's iron lock was rusted, and the ground was thick with the grime of soot and river mud. Holmes crouched without hesitation, examining the threshold. "There," he said softly. "Do you see it, Watson?" I knelt beside him, peering at the damp cobbles. "A scuff," I said after a moment. "The stone surface is broken." "Indeed. And see how it runs diagonally. Toward the crates, not the steps. Someone stood here recently, and not idly, but in motion." He took out his magnifying lens, tracing the marks. 2 separate impressions, a heavy boot and a second, narrower tread. Recently. The moisture has preserved the depth. I looked up. Then Reuben Glass's story holds weight. "Perhaps," Holmes said thoughtfully. "But what interests me more is the absence of blood. If Mr. Ashcroft struck his head here and collapsed, we should see some evidence. Splatter, a stain at the corner, especially if he lay undiscovered for several hours in this cold." Holmes turned and made for the edge of the wharf, peering over the low iron railing that bordered the drop to the riverbank below. "The body was found here, you said?" "Yes," said Quarles, joining him. "Just beneath the overhang. The mud had half covered him when Reuben found him. The high tide had passed an hour earlier." Holmes's eyes scanned the slope. "And the red ledger? No trace?" Quarles shook his head. "Not a page. We scoured the office and adjoining rooms. There's no record of any crimson-bound volume among our accounting ledgers." "Curious," Holmes murmured. "Would Ashcroft have kept personal records separate from your shared files?" "Possibly. He was a meticulous man, but private when it came to certain contracts. We have clients abroad, textile merchants from Calais and a spice trader in Alexandria. He may have maintained confidential records." Holmes nodded absently, his attention drawn to a corner where the railing was bent slightly outward. He stepped toward it, brushing a finger along the metal. "Watson, observe the paint scraped from this edge." I followed. The iron showed a fresh, silvery scrape, distinct from the rest of the rusting barrier. "Someone or something struck this recently," Holmes mused. "A trunk, perhaps, or a person falling, but from inside, not climbing up from the bank. This mark is no more than 2 days old." Holmes straightened. "Let us speak to the watchman now." Reuben Glass was a grizzled fellow in his early 60s, with eyes like 2 hard coals and a voice thick with river air. Stood nervously as we entered his hut, clutching a chipped mug of tea. "I told Mr. Quarles what I saw," he began. "I swear on my mother's name, I saw Mr. Ashcroft just after 11. He was in the side doorway with a red book in one hand. He looked right at me. He did. Seemed agitated, then turned back inside. Did you see anyone else on the premises? Holmes asked. No, sir. No carriages, no footsteps. Quiet as a tomb, save for the river. And you're certain of the time? I keep this clock beside me, sir. Always set by St. Paul's bell. I looked at it right after I saw him, 11 past 11. Holmes stared at the man. And you told the constable this? I did. But he just scratched his head and said, maybe I dreamed it. I didn't, sir. Holmes turned to Quarles. Has anything been disturbed since the incident? I locked the office that morning and opened it only for you. Very good. Dr. Watson and I will examine the office alone. We entered the main building through the front, and I immediately noted the contrast between the crumbling exterior and the meticulous interior. The office itself was orderly to the point of obsession. Ledgers were stacked chronologically, shelves labeled with alphabetical precision. Holmes scanned the shelves quickly, eyes narrowing. Watson, note this. Shelf space H to K appears disturbed. The gap here is wider than the rest. Something was recently removed. He crouched, running his fingers over the wooden surface. A fine trace of red thread, barely visible. Silk, I believe. My pulse quickened. The ledger? Possibly. But why shelve it here? This isn't a secure cabinet. If Ashcroft meant to keep it private, he would have locked it in his desk. Holmes opened the top drawer. Inside was a bundle of correspondence, a sealed tin of pipe tobacco, and a small brass-handled letter opener. Curious, Holmes said. The tobacco is Egyptian. He smoked Turkish until recently. He replaced the drawer's contents and turned to the tall window that overlooked the wharf. Someone wanted that red ledger, and badly enough to kill for it. But they searched after the fact, not before. That speaks to improvisation. He stepped back, eyes distant. The answers lie not only in what's missing, but in what was overlooked. We must speak to Ashcroft's family, and I should like a word with your foreign clients, Mr. Quarles. Something tells me this case has its roots far from London's river fog. Shall I prepare letters? Quarles asked. None but I believe Watson and I shall travel to Hampstead this afternoon. The widow may know more than the watchman. And with that, Holmes turned from the office, his expression sharpening as the fog of deduction began to clear in his brilliant mind. Our cab rattled through the well-ordered streets of Hampstead later that afternoon, the fog having thinned only slightly since morning, allowing glimpses of iron-gated villas and ivy-clad townhouses peering like watchful sentinels through the mist. It was an affluent district, far removed from the damp stones and industrial murk of Whitechapel. Yet, as Holmes observed with keen detachment, wealth often concealed its own brand of shadow. Mrs. Horatio Ashcroft resided in a tall Georgian residence on Queen's Grove, a home of polished brass, lace curtains, and a carriage lamp that had been recently polished, its glass gleaming with unnatural precision. Holmes took one look at the steps, noted the scuff on the lowest slate, and nodded to me. 2 visitors already this morning, both gentlemen, one with a cane, one without. The former smoked Russian cigars, the latter carried a leather satchel. See the faint flake of red sealing wax there, Watson? I followed his gaze and indeed saw the evidence, though I had entirely missed it before. Not Scotland Yard, then? I asked. Not unless they've taken up diplomatic habits, Holmes murmured. Let us see if Mrs. Ashcroft is as fastidious as her doorman. The butler who admitted us was a tall, elderly man named Finch, whose every movement suggested a lifetime of dignity and deference. He led us to a drawing-room of elegant restraint, where the widow sat beside a window of pale winter light. Her mourning attire was immaculate. Jet beads, black silk gloves, and a veil so sheer one could read her expression beneath it. I thank you for coming, Mr. Holmes. I received word from Mr. Quarles this morning, and I understand you are investigating my husband's passing. Her voice faltered only slightly, But there was something in her tone, a strain not from grief alone, but from something harder, a held-back truth, or perhaps a carefully rehearsed lie. Holmes bowed. "Our purpose is to illuminate what others have hastily declared, madam. And if that disturbs your peace, I beg forgiveness in advance." "I would rather be disturbed by truth than comforted by error," she replied quickly. Holmes took a seat across from her, steepling his fingers. "Your husband died late in the evening, far past his usual hours at the office. Did he often return to the warehouse after supper?" "Rarely," she answered. "Mr. Ashcroft was a creature of habit. He dined at 8, read his financial pages, and retired at 10 without variation. That Thursday was unusual in one regard. He received a telegram at 7:30 and left within 10 minutes. Holmes's eyes sharpened. "A telegram?" "Yes. It came by special messenger. He read it, said he would return shortly, and left without his coat, despite the cold. I insisted he take the carriage, but he declined." "Do you have the telegram?" "I'm afraid not. He took it with him and never returned." Holmes's brows are knitted. "Are you certain he was left alone?" "I saw him from the drawing-room window. He crossed the square on foot. Finch saw no carriage arrive, nor anyone waiting." Holmes turned to the butler. "Mr. Finch, were there any visitors that evening before or after Mr. Ashcroft left?" Finch cleared his throat delicately. "None, sir. But the phone rang twice between 9 and 10. The caller hung up both times when I answered." "Curious," Holmes muttered. "Silent calls. Not the work of pranksters in Hampstead, I imagine." "Was that common?" "No, sir. Quite out of the ordinary." Mrs. Ashcroft adjusted the position of a glass paperweight on the end table beside her. "Mr. Holmes," she said suddenly, her voice quieter, "I do not pretend to understand all my husband's affairs. He was devoted to his company, to discretion, and to contracts I was never meant to read. But I believe someone meant to frighten him that evening, or compel him." "Compel?" She nodded slowly. There was something in his eyes after he read the telegram. Not fear exactly, but resolve. As if he'd decided something. "And may I speak frankly?" "Please," Holmes said. "I believe he destroyed something before he left." Holmes leaned forward. "What leads you to that conclusion?" "His study reeked of burnt paper when I passed by it later that night. The fireplace had been recently raked, and yet no logs had been added. I didn't wish to intrude at the time, but I now think he may have burned something he didn't wish to find." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. "I did not inform the police," she continued, "because I feared they would treat it as irrelevant. But if something of importance is missing, something red perhaps, then I thought you should know." Holmes stood and walked to the bookshelf lining the far wall. He scanned the spines but did not touch them. Then he turned back with a distant look in his eyes. "Tell me, madam, have you ever heard the name Sylvain Mercier?" She blinked. "No, I don't believe so. Or perhaps Colonel Dashiell Norwood." A pause. "He was a guest once." "Briefly. I believe he dined with Horatio and a French merchant." "Would that merchant have worn a signet ring with a swan carved in onyx?" Now her eyes widened just slightly. "Yes. He had an odd way of folding his napkin as well, into a shape like a fan. Horatio found it amusing." Holmes nodded slowly. "And this was how long ago?" 5 weeks. "Was the Frenchman's name Benoit Charvet?" "Yes," she said after a moment. "Yes, I believe it was." "Thank you," Holmes said softly. "You have been most helpful." He turned to leave, but paused in the doorway. "One last question, madam. Do you believe your husband feared for his life?" She hesitated. "No, not in the ordinary sense. But he knew something was coming, that much I can say. He once told me, when money begins to whisper in multiple languages, someone always ends up dead." Holmes gave a grim smile. "Patterns of betrayal," he said. "Some of these recipients are the same merchants connected to Colonel Norwood. And more disturbingly, One of them is marked with both a green underline and a red X. The name was written in careful, sloping script, Reuben Glass. I stared. The night watchman? Holmes nodded. A quiet man, loyal on the surface, but perhaps loyal to more than one master. But what would he gain? Access, Holmes said, to the warehouse, to Ashcroft's movements, and possibly to Clara's too. If he knew about the ledger's existence, he may have been the pursuer Murch saw. The man in gloves. A low groan echoed through the embankment, followed by the soft clink of shifting metal. Holmes stiffened. Quickly, Watson, we're not alone. We stashed the ledger back into its oilskin, and Holmes slipped it beneath his coat. From the shadowed archway beyond the steps, a figure emerged, limping slightly, a scarf pulled high over the mouth, but unmistakably familiar. It was Gideon Murch. Holmes stepped forward, hand at the ready. You should be in your flat, Mr. Murch. Why follow us here? I had to, he said hoarsely. They came for me last night, after you left. They? 2 men, foreign, one with a crooked finger, the other with a limp. They said I knew too much. Told me to keep silent, or next time they'd not be asking. And you didn't go to the police? I asked. Wouldn't have mattered. I figured you were the only ones actually digging. Holmes considered him for a moment. And what do you want now? To give you this, he said, producing a torn scrap of paper from his coat. I found it jammed beneath my floorboard this morning. It wasn't there before. Holmes took the note. It was part of a larger document, torn cleanly on 3 sides, but one word stood out in bold script. Ashcroft, contingency. Beneath it, a phrase in French. Si découvert, remettre à l'ambassade. If discovered, deliver to the embassy, Holmes translated. Which embassy? I asked. There's only one embassy that Clara Evans would trust with this level of leverage, Holmes replied grimly. The French. Murch looked between us nervously. Am I free to go? For now, Holmes said. But keep your doors locked, and if you see anyone with a limp and a scarf, run. Murch didn't wait to be told twice. He turned and limped up the stairs and vanished into the fog. Holmes and I ascended after him more cautiously. As we emerged once more onto the riverside street, Holmes held the ledger with both hands, as though weighing it. This is no longer about a single death, he said quietly. It's about leverage, power, and the lengths to which desperate people will go to erase their past. We returned to Baker Street by dusk, where Holmes immediately began. Please, Holmes remained standing. We'll not detain you long. I come regarding Horatio Ashcroft Charvet's fingers paused mid-drum. A tragic accident. An accident, Holmes repeated. Of course. The report was clear. A fall near the docks. You visited his Hampstead residence 5 weeks ago, dined with him and Colonel Norwood. I did. Is that unusual? Not for a man brokering shipping contracts, but rather more so when those contracts never passed through Ashcroft's clerk or entered the official ledgers. Charvet raised an eyebrow. My business with Mr. Ashcroft was private. Indeed, and perhaps related to a crimson-bound ledger now missing. The Frenchman's smile returned, though it did not touch his eyes. I do not keep track of other men's diaries. Holmes finally took a seat opposite him, folding his hands. Let us speak plainly. Ashcroft was seen late Thursday night holding such a ledger. By morning, he was dead. We are both aware that the French textile markets have been unstable of late. False shipments, inflated weight records, and duplicate manifests sent to colonial buyers. Charvet leaned forward slightly. If you have a question, monsieur, ask it. Holmes's tone was suddenly calm, almost conversational. Did Ashcroft threaten to expose someone? Charvet tilted his head. Expose? That would require that he not be a participant. Was he? Charvet did not answer. Instead, he rose, walked to the fire, and stared into the flames. Let me offer you something instead. A warning. Holmes said nothing. There are ledgers. Charvet continued. "And then there are ledgers. Some are meant for auditors, others for those who prefer silence bought in ink. Ashcroft was an ambitious man. He grew tired of being a conduit and wished to be a gatekeeper." "A gatekeeper to what?" I asked. Charvet turned slightly, his silhouette sharp against the flickering hearth. "To information. Shipments. Routes. Names. A man with enough silence can barter for a very loud price." "Who else stood to gain from his death?" Holmes asked. Charvet's expression cooled. "Perhaps you misunderstand me, Mr. Holmes. I did not kill Ashcroft, nor did I need to. He was already drowning in too many languages. But ask yourself, who would fear that his next translation might be their ruin?" Holmes stood as well, adjusting his gloves. "I presume that is not you?" Charvet smiled faintly. "I never fear what I can afford." Holmes nodded. "One last thing, monsieur. On the evening of Ashcroft's death, 2 silent telephone calls were placed to his residence between 9 and 10. Did you place them?" Charvet regarded him levelly. "Number, but I know who might have. Find the man who wears gloves, even when writing a letter. He's not afraid of fingerprints. He's afraid of ink." Without another word, Charvet turned back to the fire, leaving us with more riddles than answers. We left the club in silence, the heavy doors closing behind us like the lid of a well-latched trunk. Outside, the fog had begun to lift slightly, the first hints of lamplight breaking through like lanterns from another world. Holmes pulled his collar up against the chill. He's lying, of course. About what? About not fearing Ashcroft. He came here today prepared for that conversation, his every move rehearsed. But the mention of gloves, now that, Watson, was not improvisation. It was deliberate. You believe he's directing us somewhere? I believe he's diverting us from something. We rode back to Baker Street as night began to fall, the rhythm of hooves muffled by the damp streets and the city still wrapped in the day's hush. Holmes lit his pipe the moment we entered our sitting room, pacing before the fire as though the mere act might summon revelation. "He said Ashcroft wished to be a gatekeeper," he said aloud. "That implies he was no longer just recording transactions. He was controlling access, which means the ledger is not just evidence, it's leverage. Leverage against whom? Against someone with secrets in the cargo manifests, possibly smuggling, possibly military contracts. But what matters is who wants it silenced." Holmes paused, then turned to the desk. He opened a drawer and withdrew a thin folder, his private collection of clippings, rumors, and half-confirmed whispers. "Watson, do you recall the shipping thefts at the Calais dry docks last autumn? The missing seals on cargo crates?" "Yes. No arrests were made, because someone bought silence." He leafed through his notes until he found what he sought, a customs report signed by a naval logistics officer. "Colonel Dashiell Norwood, our dinner guest." I frowned. "Then Norwood may be the key." "Possibly. But more likely, he was the intermediary. Which brings us to the question, where is the red ledger now? And who knew Ashcroft had it last?" Holmes tapped his pipe against the mantel. "We must return to the warehouse. There's a detail I neglected, something Reuben Glass said that we didn't challenge." "The watchman?" Holmes nodded. He saw Ashcroft holding the ledger. But what did he not see? Did anyone leave the building after Ashcroft returned? If not, then the ledger never left the premises. At least not that night. "And if it didn't leave," I said slowly, "then someone returned later." "Exactly," Holmes said. "Someone who wore gloves to handle it, and perhaps left no trace. Tomorrow morning, Watson, we return to Ashcroft Wharf. I suspect the river mud still holds at least one secret." We returned to Ashcroft Wharf early the next morning under a pallid sky veiled in gauze-like mist. The river moved sluggishly, slate-colored and silent, and the warehouses that loomed above it stood like the forgotten towers of some sleeping industrial kingdom. Holmes walked ahead with swift, clipped steps, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed not on the buildings themselves, but on the ground, on the fine film of river mud and soot that coated the cobbles like a shroud. "Observe, Watson," he said without turning. "These are not the prints of an ordinary worker." I looked down to where he pointed. A partial footprint, no more than a shallow crescent in the silt, was visible beneath the overhang where the iron railing bent outward. The heel is unusually narrow, I noted. Almost delicate. Precisely. This is not a laborer's boot, and it is fresh. No more than 12 hours old, judging by the state of the mud. I hesitated. "So someone returned during the night?" Holmes nodded. "Likely the same individual who removed the ledger, if indeed it was taken after the fact. What is remarkable is that there is only one set of prints leading in, and none leading out." I blinked. "Then the intruder is still inside?" "Unlikely," he replied. "But not impossible?" "Come, let us not speculate. Let us examine the interior." Tobias Quarles met us just inside the office door, looking even more rumpled than before. His eyes were bloodshot, his collar undone. "I arrived barely half an hour ago," he said in a low voice. "The door was unlocked. I swear I locked it yesterday before leaving." "Did you touch anything?" Holmes asked at once. "Not a thing. I noticed a smell, something faint, like tobacco smoke, but heavier." Holmes's face sharpened. "Like scorched cloth?" Quarles nodded. "Yes, exactly." Holmes pushed past into the main office. The once pristine order had been disrupted, slightly but unmistakably. A chair had been shifted half an inch from its usual spot. The corner of a page in the shipping manifest was bent, and one of the ledgers lay slightly askew on the middle shelf. But it was the smell Holmes had identified first. Acrid, lingering. "Someone lit a match recently," he said. "Or perhaps something more exotic. Watson, what do you make of this?" I followed him to the central filing cabinet, where he had opened the top drawer. Holmes held up a scrap of something red, twisted, frayed at the edges, and faintly singed. "Silk?" I ventured. He nodded. "The binding thread of a ledger, no doubt. Someone attempted to destroy it, but why leave this fragment?" He turned to Quarles. "Did Ashcroft own any gloves?" "Yes, of course. Several pairs." "Were any missing after his death?" I don't know," Quarles admitted. "I could inquire with Mrs. Ashcroft." Holmes nodded absently and continued his search. We followed him into the adjoining ledger room, a narrow, high-ceilinged space lined with shelves. Light filtered dimly through a barred window set high in the wall. Holmes's eyes swept across the shelves, then narrowed at a curious detail. "Watson," he said, "do you see it? That shelf, third from the bottom." I stepped closer. A gap had been filled with a book of the wrong color, navy blue amid a run of forest green. Holmes pulled it down and opened it. Inside, the pages had been neatly removed and replaced with blank parchment, save for the first 2 leaves, where a single phrase had been written in French. "Ce qui est effacé est parfois ce qui crie le plus fort." What is erased is sometimes what screams the loudest. He closed the book. A message, meant for someone who knew where to look. Quarles leaned in. "That wasn't here yesterday." "Nor was the smell of scorched silk," Holmes murmured. "Someone returned during the night, searched again, and left this behind. As a warning, or a taunt. And yet they didn't take this fake ledger with them," I said. "Because it serves a purpose here," Holmes said, "to suggest that the original was already destroyed, but I suspect that is untrue." He walked to the far wall where a row of cabinets sat below a low sill. Bending, he pulled a small folding mirror from his coat pocket and used it to peer behind the rear leg of the cabinet. "Ah," he said softly. He reached behind the unit and withdrew a fine leather glove. Left hand, tan in color, the fingers slightly wrinkled and the cuff stained with soot. "No markings," he muttered. "But the sizing is unusual. Narrow wrist, long fingers." This was not a workman's glove, more likely a woman, and from the look of the scorched residue near the hem, this was used to handle something recently burned. I glanced at Quarles. You said no one has been in the warehouse since yesterday. No one that I know of, he said. I mean, the only person with a full set of keys, besides myself and Mr. Ashcroft, was... He stopped. Go on, Holmes said. Clara, Miss Clara Evans. She was Ashcroft's personal secretary for 3 years. Resigned last week, very suddenly. Holmes's brows lifted. Why? She claimed she was going to marry a businessman from Edinburgh. Said she wanted a new life. Did she say where this suitor lived? No, just vaguely mentioned travel plans. Did she ever handle the financial ledgers? All the time, Ashcroft trusted her completely. She typed his correspondence, sealed his confidential reports, and often worked late. Holmes's face darkened slightly. This is the second time her name has come up in a case like this. Miss Clara Evans was also employed by a textile firm in Geneva 2 years ago, dealing in French exports. The company collapsed under accusations of double ledger keeping and falsified customs. Quarles went pale. You're certain? Quite. I remember her name because she once visited me in disguise, pretending to seek work as a governess. She was after information then, about a baronet's shipping interests. She failed, but evidently she has refined her methods. And now she's vanished, I said. Holmes tucked the glove into a handkerchief and placed it carefully in his pocket. Not vanished, Watson. Not yet. She simply changed her coat. And likely her name. Quarles leaned on the back of a chair, visibly shaken. Do you believe she killed Mr. Ashcroft? Holmes considered this for a long moment. Number, not directly. Miss Evans is many things, but impulsive is not one of them. She's a planner, and planners delegate. He looked again at the fake ledger, his gaze tightening. This entire trail, Charvet, the ledger fragment, the glove, is a pattern of layers, each meant to delay or mislead. Which tells me one thing quite clearly. The real crimson silk ledger still exists, and someone, somewhere, is still afraid of what's inside. He turned toward the door. Watson, we're going to pay a call to someone who may not know they're part of this plot. An old dock worker named Gideon Murch. He was once caught smuggling French cognac through Ashcroft's shipping yard. Reuben Glass mentioned him once, in passing. To what end? I asked. To the end, Holmes said quietly, of unraveling who really placed the ledger in Ashcroft's hands, and who was waiting to take it back. The sun had just crested the haze of the East End when we left Ashcroft Wharf behind and descended into the twisting labyrinth of alleyways near the Limehouse docks, where the Thames lapped with weary indifference against pilings weathered by time and salt. It was here, among the chipped bricks, sagging ironworks, and the ever-present stench of coal and tide, that one could still find remnants of an older London, grimy, secretive, and indifferent to the law's polite inquiries. Holmes led the way without hesitation, cutting through mists and market carts as though he had charted the route by instinct. His cane tapped the stones with rhythmic precision. After several turns, he paused before a low structure wedged between a sailmaker's shop and an alehouse of questionable repute. The door bore no knocker, only a faded paint smudge that might once have been a name. This, he announced, is the residence of Mr. Gideon Murch, smuggler, part-time cooper, and an occasional informer when the mood, or the threat, suits him. And you believe he's involved? I asked. I believe, said Holmes, that he saw something and has yet to realize its value. He knocked twice. Firm, economical raps. After a delay, footsteps shuffled inside, followed by a rasping voice. If you're with the excise office again, I told you last week. I'm not, Holmes called back. I'm with no one. But I've come with a name and a question. The name is Horatio Ashcroft. The question, what did you see on Thursday night? The bolt slid back with surprising speed. The door creaked open, revealing a hunched figure with shoulders like ship timbers and a face weathered by wind and whiskey. One eye was clouded, the other sharp with suspicion. "Who the devil are you?" "Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We are not here to report you. We are here to buy your memory." Gideon Murch blinked, then grunted. "Come in, then. But keep your hands where I can see them." The interior smelled of sea salt, tobacco, and vinegar. A narrow bed was pushed beneath a filthy window, and a cracked teapot sat atop a crate used as a table. Murch gestured to two mismatched stools. "I don't like questions," he said, "but I like coins well enough." Holmes produced a sovereign from his coat pocket and placed it on the table without a flourish. "I heard you once ran cargo through Ashcroft's yard," Holmes began. "I did," said Murch, pocketing the coin without shame. "2 years ago, nothing but good French spirit." "No harm done." "And you were there Thursday evening?" "Aye, downriver mostly, helping a mate unload tin barrels under the cover of fog. Legal enough, mostly." "Did you pass by Ashcroft Wharf?" "I did, around midnight. The fog was thick, but the wharf lamps were lit." "Did you see anyone?" Murch scratched at his beard. "I did. A figure down near the northern side, where the crates form that crooked alley. But it wasn't Ashcroft." "Describe them," Holmes said quickly. "Tall, thin. Couldn't see the face, but the walk was wrong. Too graceful for a man in trade. More like a dancer, or a woman trying not to look like one." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. She carried something, a book or a parcel under one arm. Kept glancing over her shoulder, then a shadow broke from the crates and followed her. Holmes leaned in. A second figure. Aye, shorter, stockier, gloved hands. They argued, whispered mostly, but I caught a bit. "Ledger," I heard. "It ends tonight." Then there was a scuffle. The tall one broke away, the other gave chase. "Which direction?" "Toward the river." "And then?" "I kept my head down," Murch said, unashamed. "Didn't fancy getting caught in another man's quarrel. I circled the long way and went back to my flat." Holmes stood and produced another coin. "One final question. Did you see which way the tall figure ran? Toward the warehouse or away from it?" "Toward it, fast, like she knew the place." Holmes nodded. "You've been very helpful, Mr. Murch. If anyone else comes asking, Scotland Yard or a well-dressed foreigner with a quiet voice, you've seen nothing." Murch's eyes glittered. "You think they'll come back?" "I think," said Holmes as we turned to leave. "They never really left." Once outside, Holmes quickened his pace. The woman, almost certainly Clara Evans. The gloved pursuer, unknown. But the phrase, "it ends tonight," is damning. I matched his stride. So the ledger was still intact at midnight. That places its destruction or theft after the altercation. Precisely. The fact that the pursuer didn't catch her tells us she succeeded in hiding it, likely inside the warehouse, before she fled. We turned onto a quieter street and Holmes flagged down a cab. As we climbed in, he spoke with uncharacteristic intensity. "Watson, I must speak to Mrs. Ashcroft again. Alone. There is a variable we have not yet tested." "And I?" "You," he said, "are to pay a visit to Mr. Lionel Chiswick." I blinked. "Who?" "A solicitor in Lincoln's Inn. His name appears in one of the false ledgers associated with shipping insurance claims. If Clara Evans was acting under instruction, we must know who employed her. Begin with Chiswick. Use whatever means you must." "And if he refuses to talk?" "Tell him you're acting under Holmes's instruction and that he can speak now or be questioned later by the Yard." "And Holmes?" He smiled faintly. "We'll be laying a trap." The cab clattered away in opposite directions soon after. Holmes toward the hushed avenues of Hampstead, I toward the solemn sandstone courts of legal London. Yet neither of us knew just how swiftly the fog was thickening behind our backs. Back in his study, Gideon Murch sat alone, fingering the coins Holmes had given him. He tossed them into a rusted tin, then rose to draw his curtains shut. But just before he reached the window, a knock sounded at the door. Not the brisk, declarative knock of Holmes, but something softer, slower, and much colder. My cab drew to a halt outside Lincoln's Inn just past noon, the fog having lifted into a dull overcast that cast the barrister's court in hues of stone and parchment. The air had a brittle sharpness to it, the kind that made one walk briskly and speak more formally. As I stepped out and made my way beneath the Gothic arches, I could not help but feel the peculiar weight of the legal world, where truths are dressed in clauses and lies take shelter beneath fine penmanship. Mr. Lionel Chiswick's offices occupied a modest corner suite on the third floor, marked by a discreet brass plaque and a dark green door that bore no knocker. I knocked twice anyway. A young clerk with ink-stained cuffs opened and gave me a wary look. "I've come to speak with Mr. Chiswick," I said, producing my card. "Dr. John Watson, on behalf of Mr. Sherlock Holmes." The clerk's eyes flickered just briefly before he motioned me inside. "Wait here, sir." The waiting room was small, with tightly packed law books lining the walls and a grandfather clock ticking with funereal solemnity. After a few moments, the inner door opened, and a tall, lean man of perhaps 50 entered, his grey hair slicked back with care and his expression that of a man used to badgering questions, rarely answering them. "Dr. Watson," he said with cool civility. "To what do I owe this unannounced honor?" "To a matter of urgency, Mr. Chiswick. I believe your name appears in a set of shipping ledgers recently discovered in connection with the death of Mr. Horatio Ashcroft." His eyes narrowed just slightly. "That is quite the statement. Do you have these ledgers?" "No," I said plainly. "But we have records of irregular insurance filings routed through Ashcroft's firm, claims on delayed shipments that never left port and compensations arranged through your office. That would be the domain of my junior partners. But the signatures match yours," I added. He paused. "Suppose they do. What is it you believe occurred?" "I believe," I said carefully, "that someone in your network used Ashcroft's influence to approve false shipping manifests, and when he threatened to expose the deception, he was silenced." Mr. Chiswick folded his arms. "If you're implying murder, you should speak to Scotland Yard." "I'm implying leverage, Mr. Chiswick, and I suspect Miss Clara Evans was the courier between your office and Ashcroft's. She left her post under curious circumstances, and now she's missing." At this, something flickered behind his eyes. It was not quite a surprise, not quite fearful, but it was something. "I hired Miss Evans once," he admitted. "Briefly, a sharp mind. Too sharp, perhaps. She left suddenly, left many things behind, actually." He walked to a locked drawer, produced a key from his chain and opened it. Inside, he retrieved a thin envelope and handed it to me. "I debated burning it," he said, "but I dislike unfinished records." I opened the envelope. Inside were 2 items, a calling card marked with the name Lucien Valois, and a note in Clara Evans' elegant hand. The note read, "If they come asking, tell them nothing. Tell them I was no one, and you remember less than that. L.V." I stared at the card. Lucien Valois? A name she used when we met in Paris. I believe she carried several. And yet you kept this. To remind myself never to employ ghosts, he said with a bitter smile. "Now if that's all, Doctor." I pocketed the envelope. "Thank you, Mr. Chiswick. But one last thing. If Clara, or Lucienne, comes back, what will you tell her?" "I'll tell her," he said, meeting my eye, "that the fog is lifting." Meanwhile, in Hampstead, Holmes had made his way once more to Queen's Grove. Finch admitted him without comment this time, and Mrs. Ashcroft received him in the same drawing room as before, though her veil had been replaced with a dark shawl and her eyes were red-rimmed. "I thought you might return," she said softly. Holmes sat without invitation. "Do you still wish for truth, madam?" "I do," even if it treads dangerously close to your household? She hesitated, then nodded. Even then. Very well. You said your husband burned something the night of his death. I now believe it was a duplicate, an imitation meant to mislead. Her fingers clutched the shawl tighter. Mr. Ashcroft kept 2 sets of records, Holmes continued. One for his partners and one for himself. The crimson silk ledger belonged to the second category, items he could use for bargaining. I was afraid of that. And someone wanted it silenced, perhaps more than one person. She said nothing, only looked toward the window where pale light filtered through lace. I must ask, Holmes said gently, about Clara Evans. When did you last speak with her? 3 days before Horatio's death, she replied. She came to say goodbye. She said she was grateful for everything and would be leaving London. She seemed off, not tearful, but strained, as if she'd made a dreadful decision and was trying to convince herself it was noble. Holmes rose and paced. She was no ordinary secretary. She operated under other names, Lucienne Valois among them. She has a habit of inserting herself into firms with international connections and then vanishing before the foundation crumbles. Mrs. Ashcroft's voice trembled. Are you saying she killed my husband? I believe she cared for him in her way, but I do believe she took something, perhaps to protect him, perhaps herself. Either way, she's now the key to locating the real ledger. At that moment, Finch entered the room. Excuse me, madam. This arrived by hand. A note for Mr. Holmes. Holmes took the folded parchment. The handwriting was familiar, looping, refined, and unmistakably Clara Evans's. He opened it and read aloud. To Mr. Holmes, if you seek the truth, go to where the tide turns, but the ledger remains dry. There you will find what Ashcroft never dared name aloud. L.V. He folded the note with care and tucked it into his coat. What does it mean? Asked Mrs. Ashcroft. It means, Holmes said grimly, that she's still playing her game. He turned toward the door. Where are you going now? She called after him. To find where the tide turns, Holmes murmured, and what Clara Evans was too afraid to hide in ink. Outside, the afternoon had begun to turn, the clouds parting just enough to let a pallid sun through. I met Holmes on the steps of Baker Street not an hour later, and we exchanged what we'd learned. She's Lucienne Valois, I said, and she warned Chiswick not to speak. She also left me a clue, Holmes replied. One that might finally take us beyond smoke and misdirection. We entered our sitting room and Holmes unrolled a map of the Thames, his finger trailing along the eastward banks. She said, where the tide turns, but the ledger remains dry. I leaned over. The Pool of London? Too broad, Holmes murmured. No, it's more precise, somewhere that touches water but avoids its consequences. He tapped a narrow inlet just east of Shadwell Basin. Whopping old stairs, high enough above the river to stay dry and secluded. A perfect hiding place. And you believe the ledger is there? If not the ledger, Holmes said, his voice taut, then the body of the person who last held it. Wapping, in the grey hour before dusk, bore the air of a place long forgotten by polite society. Warehouses stood like weary sentinels beside the murky Thames, their shutters rotting, their doors chained, while barges drifted like phantoms beyond the embankment. The tide was out, and the great river had receded from its usual banks, revealing the damp, glistening stones that formed the Wapping old stairs, those treacherous, moss-slick steps that had swallowed more than one desperate soul over the decades. Holmes and I descended from the main street to the quayside with deliberate care. The wind carried the smell of salt, mud, and smoke. Despite the hour, the area was almost eerily silent, broken only by the occasional cry of a gull or the hollow clatter of a loose shutter somewhere behind us. Holmes paused before the entrance to the old stairs, examining the rail and the worn stone ledge beside it. Note the curvature here, Watson. The water at high tide would have reached the 5th step from the top, any ledger or parcel hidden below that would have been submerged. And yet Clara said it would remain dry, I added. Which means it is not below the waterline at all, he replied. It is merely near it. Holmes stepped down the slick stairway with precision, stopping at a recessed section of the embankment wall halfway down. There, between 2 stones, his fingers paused. He produced a slender blade from his coat and began prying delicately at a small, rust-stained panel no larger than a brick. With a faint click, the panel gave way. Inside the hollow was a tightly wrapped oilskin bundle, bound with twine and bearing the faintest trace of red silk peeking from one edge. Holmes drew it out and opened it slowly. Inside lay the crimson ledger. Its cover was elegant, worn at the corners, but clearly made to last. The stitching, unmistakably silk, shimmered faintly in the low light. Holmes opened the first page and studied the ink. "Written in 2 hands," he muttered. "Ashcroft's and, yes, Miss Evans's." "Do we take it to Scotland Yard?" I asked. "Not yet," he said, eyes still scanning the entries. This is more than proof of smuggling. These are coded references, shipments, names, and destinations. Some have been underlined in green. Others are marked with a star in the margin. He flipped a few pages forward. "Ah, what is it?" "A ledger entry dated 2 days before Ashcroft's death. A shipment to Marseille. Recipient marked only by initials. L.V. "Lucien Valois," I said. "Quite." "And the green markings?" "Patterns of betrayal," he said. "Some of these recipients are the same merchants connected to Colonel Norwood. And more disturbingly, one of them is marked with both a green underline and a red X. The name was written in careful, sloping script, Reuben Glass. I stared. "The night watchman?" Holmes nodded. "A quiet man, loyal on the surface, but perhaps loyal to more than one master. But what would he gain?" "Access," Holmes said. "To the warehouse, to Ashcroft's movements, and possibly to Clara's too. If he knew about the ledger's existence, he may have been the pursuer Murch saw." "The man in gloves." A low groan echoed through the embankment, followed by the soft clink of shifting metal. Holmes stiffened. "Quickly, Watson, we're not alone." We stashed the ledger back into its oilskin, and Holmes slipped it beneath his coat. From the shadowed archway beyond the steps, a figure emerged, limping slightly, a scarf pulled high over the mouth, but unmistakably familiar. It was Gideon Murch. Holmes stepped forward, hand at the ready. "You should be in your flat, Mr. Murch. Why follow us here?" "I had to," he said hoarsely. "They came for me last night, after you left." "They?" "2 men, foreign, one with a crooked finger, the other with a limp. They said I knew too much. Told me to keep silent, or next time they'd not be asking." "And you didn't go to the police?" I asked. "Wouldn't have mattered. I figured you were the only ones actually digging." Holmes considered him for a moment. "And what do you want now?" "To give you this," he said, producing a torn scrap of paper from his coat. "I found it jammed beneath my floorboard this morning. It wasn't there before." Holmes took the note. It was part of a larger document, torn cleanly on 3 sides, but one word stood out in bold script: Ashcroft, contingency. Beneath it, a phrase in French: "Si découvert, remettre à l'ambassade." "If discovered, deliver to the embassy," Holmes translated. "Which embassy?" I asked. "There's only one embassy that Clara Evans would trust with this level of leverage," Holmes replied grimly. "The French." Murch looked between us nervously. "Am I free to go?" "For now," Holmes said. "But keep your doors locked, and if you see anyone with a limp and a scarf, run." Murch didn't wait to be told twice. He turned and limped up the stairs and vanished into the fog. Holmes and I ascended after him more cautiously. As we emerged once more onto the riverside street, Holmes held the ledger with both hands, as though weighing it. "This is no longer about a single death," he said quietly. "It's about leverage, power, and the lengths to which desperate people will go to erase their past." We returned to Baker Street by dusk, where Holmes immediately began, cross-referencing the names in the ledger with his private archives. Pages were spread across the table, a fresh pot of tea ignored, and the fire crackled with unnecessary intensity. "What are you looking for?" I asked. "A pattern," he murmured. "A common thread. Clara Evans may have written the ledger's contents, but she did not conceive of the network. She was a functionary, sharp, yes, but not the architect." He tapped a name in the margins. "Here, Benoit Charvet. We've seen him before." "And Lionel Chiswick," I added, pointing to a green-inked entry. "But look closer," Holmes said. "This name, Granger." I leaned over. "I don't recognize it." "Because it's not a name you find in shipping. It's a yard man. Inspector Jacob Granger, Internal Affairs." Then someone inside Scotland Yard was being paid to look away, or worse, to delay, likely the one who ruled Ashcroft's death an accident. Holmes stood abruptly. "Watson, fetch your revolver. We go to Scotland Yard, not through the front door, but to the private office of Inspector Lestrade. He may have friends in low places, but he knows how to read handwriting." "And the ledger?" "Remains with me," Holmes said, placing it into a locked briefcase. "But tonight we set the trap. Clara Evans began with a whisper. We shall end with a net." It was well past 8 o'clock when we reached Scotland Yard, the dark bulk of the great building rising from the fog like a courthouse carved from smoke and shadow. Gas lights flickered along the facade, casting trembling shadows across the pavement. The wind off the river had taken on a sharper edge, and even Holmes seemed briefly affected, tightening his coat as we approached the side entrance, the one used not by constables, but by those who knew which doors led where discretion began. Inside, the building was quieter than usual. Most of the desks in the common hall were empty, though the occasional officer passed by with the weary gait of a man writing reports rather than chasing criminals. Holmes ignored them all. He strode directly toward the private corridor where higher-ranking detectives maintained their offices. Inspector Lestrade greeted us in his narrow room, his jacket unbuttoned and a sheaf of papers in his hand. His mustache twitched as he looked up. "Holmes, Dr. Watson, you're late, and you look like you've come to accuse me of treason." "Not at all, Lestrade," Holmes said, removing his gloves, "though we have come with a matter that requires your full confidence. And, if possible, a private viewing of the internal misconduct files for the past year." Lestrade stared. "That's not a small request." "It's not a small crime," Holmes replied. Within moments, the door was locked and the three of us were seated around Lestrade's desk. Holmes removed the crimson ledger from his briefcase and opened it to a specific page. Then, without a word, he handed it to the inspector. Lestrade's eyes skimmed the entries. When he reached the underlined name, Granger, he stopped. "Jacob Granger?" he asked slowly. "One of ours. He's been with the Yard for 12 years. "And under quiet investigation for 2, Holmes said. "Connected to a customs bribery ring in 1893. The matter was closed due to insufficient corroboration, but Ashcroft reopened that door when he began tracking altered shipping manifests." Lestrade exhaled. "If this ledger is real, it is," Holmes said. "Ashcroft paid a price for compiling it. Clara Evans tried to shield its contents, and we believe Granger, or someone working with him, was responsible for silencing them both." Lestrade's face darkened. "Where is Granger now?" "According to your roster," Holmes replied. "He's on night rotation, but I have a better idea." He stood and crossed to the small cupboard near the wall, where a tray of tea and a file sat beside a locked drawer. "Do you recall, Lestrade, when we baited a blackmailer in that jewelry forgery case?" Lestrade gave a dry chuckle. You mean when you impersonated a Polish ambassador's nephew and sent the criminal into a panic? Precisely. I propose we try something similar. Holmes turned to me. Watson, are you prepared for a touch of theatre? I nodded. Within reason. Holmes opened the ledger to a blank page near the end and wrote quickly in a bold, slanted hand. Deliver at once to Inspector Granger, package retrieved from Wapping. Confirm the presence of ledger fragments. Evans compromised. He folded the note and sealed it with a wax stamp from Lestrade's drawer. Nothing more than a general seal used for internal notices. Then he handed it to Lestrade. You will give this to one of your most trusted runners. Have it delivered to Granger's desk within the next 15 minutes. He will believe we've intercepted a portion of the ledger and that we suspect Evans of betrayal. He'll come sniffing to confirm what we know, and, more importantly, what we don't. And when he does, Holmes's voice turned cold. We will be listening. Lestrade gave a reluctant nod, summoned a constable, and handed off the note with strict instructions. Within minutes, we had relocated to the adjoining observation room, a cramped space filled with dusty ledgers, a narrow ventilation duct, and a hidden window that overlooked the corridor near Granger's office. Holmes, peering through the slatted panel, was utterly still. I stood beside him, revolver holstered beneath my coat, nerves prickling. We waited nearly 20 minutes. Then came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. A man of medium height entered the corridor, his coat collar raised, his gait steady. He paused before his door, scanned the hallway, and stepped inside. Holmes's fingers tapped the sill. Once. Now. A faint clicking followed. Lestrade had stationed a trusted clerk in the adjoining office with a listening device wired to a speaking tube, a crude but effective method Holmes had used before. As the static cleared, a voice filtered through the vent. Package? What do you mean it's only a fragment? Who brought this in? A second voice, younger and nervous, replied, I don't know, sir. It was marked urgent. Something about Wapping, said Evans was compromised. A pause. Papers rustling. Then Granger's voice again. Lower now. If they've got the ledger, the others won't wait. We'll have to move fast. Charvet, the embassy. No one can be linked. Holmes nodded silently. Then came the crucial line. If the girl resurfaces, silence her. If Holmes gets close, make it look like Ashcroft. Accidents are clean. I felt my blood go cold. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Lestrade stepped out at once and returned with 2 uniformed men. Within moments, we heard boots pounding down the hallway. The door to Granger's office was thrown open. Inspector Jacob Granger, Lestrade said sharply, you are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and collusion in the murder of Horatio Ashcroft. A struggle ensued, brief and violent. Granger lunged for the fireplace poker, but one constable tackled him cleanly. He was dragged from the office, red-faced and snarling. You fools don't know what you've touched, he spat. That ledger means nothing without context. Fortunately, Holmes said as he entered the corridor, I have quite the talent for context. Lestrade cuffed Granger himself. Where is Clara Evans? Granger laughed. Gone, far beyond your reach. She never trusted anyone, not even Ashcroft in the end. He was hauled away before he could say more. Later that night, Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, the silence between us thick with tension. Is it over? I asked. Holmes poured himself a brandy. The Yard has its man. The embassy will no doubt deny everything. The ledger will vanish into an evidence vault, never to be mentioned again. And Clara? He glanced at the fire. Still out there, perhaps in France. Perhaps somewhere we'll never think to look. She may have saved Ashcroft's secrets, I offered. Holmes nodded, and in doing so, ensured her own exile. He turned to me. Watson, you once said I cared little for consequences. But tonight I wonder, whether knowing the truth is ever enough, if no one is left to hear it. He raised his glass. To the ghosts who keep our ledgers in silk. And in that moment, the case of the crimson silk ledger, its codes, its deceptions, and its deadly silences, felt less like a solved puzzle and more like a secret the river had chosen to share only briefly before swallowing it whole again. A week had passed since the arrest of Inspector Granger, and though the official channels at Scotland Yard had done their utmost to contain the scandal, whispers had already begun to circulate through the gentlemen's clubs, shipping offices, and consular lounges of London. The name Horatio Ashcroft, once synonymous with maritime efficiency, had become instead a symbol of dangerous discretion, the sort that attracted more than gold. Holmes, in the days following our confrontation at the Yard, had retreated into one of his moods, restless, abstracted, and only barely tethered to the ordinary world. He would rise early, retreat to his chemical table for hours, then sit by the fire with the crimson silk ledger open on his lap, as if searching its pages not for names, but for ghosts. On the 10th day, as I returned from a morning appointment, I found Holmes seated by the window with a blank sheet of paper in front of him and a single sentence written across the top. Some entries are never written in ink. I removed my gloves and hung my coat. Still haunted by it. Holmes didn't look up. Not haunted, Watson. Curious. About what? About how it all fits together, he said, gesturing to the sealed envelope on the table. This arrived this morning from Marseille. No return address. I opened the envelope cautiously. Inside was a single sheet of creamy paper bearing only a short note, typewritten and unsigned. Ashcroft knew too much, but not enough. I knew just enough, but not too much. In the end, it was always about balance. Keep the ledger safe. Some debts should remain unpaid. And at the bottom, written in pen, were 3 initials. L.V. Lucien Valois, I murmured. Holmes nodded. Clara Evans. She survived. More than that, I said, rereading the note. She's watching. Holmes turned the envelope over, revealing a small watermark, an insignia of a swan surrounded by laurel leaves. A French intelligence mark, he said. Low level, but official. She's found shelter in the only place that could make her untouchable. And the ledger? I asked. Holmes stood, walked to his bookshelf, and pulled aside a volume of Meyer's Universal Atlas. Behind it was a narrow compartment. He placed the crimson silk ledger inside and closed it gently. For now, he said, it remains hidden. Lestrade has the names he needs. Granger is under guard. The Yard has begun investigating its own. I sat opposite him. But something still troubles you. Holmes rubbed his temple. The silence. I frowned. You mean from the embassy? Number from Ashcroft himself. He rose and began to pace. Ashcroft was meticulous, Watson. Secretive, yes, but deliberate. If he feared exposure, he would not have relied on Clara alone. There would have been a failsafe, a final gesture, and yet we've found no such thing. You think there's another layer? I think, Holmes said slowly, that the last entry in the ledger may not be in the ledger at all. I blinked. You mean a physical clue? Holmes turned sharply. Something overlooked. Something symbolic. I've been considering the oilskin wrap. Do you recall it? Of course. Bound tightly, layered in wax thread and— Too tightly, Holmes interjected. Too perfect for a man in panic. I unstitched the inner seam last night. He produced a narrow strip of linen from his desk. On it, barely visible in the lamplight, was a handwritten line in faded ink. To know the game, one must see the board. The ledger is but the rule book. I leaned forward. Another metaphor? Or a direction? Holmes replied. Ashcroft was a chess enthusiast. He kept a board in his Hampstead study. I believe he hid something there. The board, Watson, the actual chess board. Within the hour, we were once again bound for Hampstead. the fog curling along the hedgerows and rooftops like smoke from an invisible fire. Mrs. Ashcroft received us with no visible surprise. "I had a feeling you'd return," she said, ushering us into the study. "You said the case was finished." "Almost," Holmes replied, "but not quite." He crossed to the desk, where the familiar wooden chessboard still lay beneath a glass dome. He lifted it carefully and examined the underside. Then, with sudden precision, he rotated the central square. A soft click echoed as a hidden drawer slid open from the side. Inside lay a folded letter, sealed in wax. Holmes removed it and handed it to the widow. "You should read it first," he said gently. She opened it with trembling fingers. Her eyes scanned the contents, and then she exhaled. "It's addressed to me," she said, "from Horatio. He wrote it the day before he died." "May we?" Holmes asked. She nodded and passed it to him. Holmes read aloud. "My dearest Emily, if you are reading this, then the waters have risen above my reach. The ledger is real, but it is not the treasure. It is only bait, meant to lure out those who believe their names can be erased by silence. I placed within its pages a false set of codes. The true list is hidden elsewhere, fragmented, protected. Clara knows one half. The other remains with Finch. If anyone comes looking, tell them nothing. But I know that I never stopped trying to undo what I helped build. Forgive me. H.A." We sat in silence. "Finch," I said at last. "The butler." Holmes nodded. "Ashcroft's most trusted servant, and we never questioned him." Mrs. Ashcroft rose at once and called for Finch, who appeared a few moments later, stoic and reserved as ever. "Finch," she said, "Mr. Holmes believes you were entrusted with something." Finch looked at her, then at us. After a long pause, he nodded. He reached into his coat and removed a small silver locket. Inside was a folded slip of paper, half a document with names, codes, and dates in Ashcroft's hand. Holmes compared it to a copy of the ledger page he had transcribed. The two halves fit perfectly. "This," he said softly, "is the real final entry." Later that night, as the fire crackled and the fog deepened over London, Holmes and I sat in quiet reflection. The ledger, the locket, and Ashcroft's letter now rested in a sealed packet, ready to be delivered to Lestrade. And yet, even in victory, Holmes's mood remained pensive. "You were right," I said at last. "Some entries are never written in ink." Holmes looked out the window, his silhouette half in shadow. "No, Watson," he replied. "Some are written in silence. Others, in sacrifice." He stood, retrieved his violin, and drew the bow across the strings. A slow, haunting melody filled the room. As the last note faded into the night, I wrote the final lines of my account. The game had been played. The board had been revealed. But like all great mysteries, this one left behind a lingering question, not of guilt, but of the cost borne by those who carry the truth in crimson silk. Spring arrived in London with unusual haste, and the bitter fogs of January receded into pale sunlit mornings and sudden bursts of bird-song echoing along Baker Street. Yet within the sitting room at 221B, the mood remained reflective rather than celebratory. The crimson silk ledger, sealed, archived, and now in the official custody of Scotland Yard, had stirred more than dust in the corridors of power. Its echoes lingered in telegrams that were never answered, in eyes that watched Holmes more closely when he passed through Pall Mall, and in the silence that had followed Clara Evans' last message. I remember that April morning clearly. I found Holmes seated by the fire, not with his usual monograph or violin in hand, but with a newspaper folded neatly in his lap. He did not look up as I entered. "You're reading the Marseille Gazette," I noted. He gestured absently. Page 4. I took it from him and found the passage circled lightly in pencil. A fire at a modest pension house near Rue Sainte has claimed the life of an unnamed woman. Authorities believe it to be accidental. No identification was found, though one guest, described only as English and reserved, failed to return from the incident. I looked up. "You think it was her?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was low. "I think it was a message, whether from Clara or those who sought her. You don't believe she's dead." He finally turned to me. "No, Watson, not unless she wished us to believe it. The swan insignia on the last letter. French intelligence does not easily surrender their assets, nor do they allow them to burn in pensions. But if Clara Evans or Lucienne Valois wished to disappear permanently, this would be the way." I set the paper down. "Then she's free." "Free?" Holmes echoed, with a strange tightness in his voice. "Freedom, for people like her, is an illusion. She will live as she always has, between shadows, under borrowed names, trusted by no one. But yes, she is alive." There was silence then. Not the strained quiet of unanswered questions, but the kind of silence that follows a well-played game where the moves have ended and only the memory of them remains. Later that afternoon, Inspector Lestrade called at Baker Street. He appeared older than I remembered. Less from age, I suspected, than from the burden of internal reckoning. The Granger affair had unearthed more than expected. 3 arrests had followed, and 2 resignations from within the yard itself. Holmes poured him a brandy. "I've come to tell you the ledger's being sealed indefinitely," Lestrade said. "Higher authorities are involved now. Names are too powerful. I thought you should know." Holmes merely nodded. Lestrade added, almost apologetically, "They're calling it the Crimson Memo, a cautionary tale. Not for the public, of course, but enough to ensure eyes are watching." "And the locket?" Holmes asked. "Returned to Mrs. Ashcroft, along with a letter of official gratitude." Holmes allowed a ghost of a smile. The state always finds its apology on paper. As Lestrade departed, Holmes stood by the window, watching the constables come and go like chessmen on a fog-worn board. After a time, he turned to me. "Do you remember what Ashcroft wrote? Some debts should remain unpaid." He wasn't speaking of money. He meant allegiance, trust, the quiet things people bargain away when they believe no one is watching. "And Clara?" "She watched," Holmes said. "Too long, too well." That evening I found a letter tucked beneath my blotter in Holmes's careful hand. It read, "Watson, should you ever choose to publish this account, let it stand not as a triumph of deduction, but as a study of silence. The greatest deceptions are not built on lies, but on omissions, on truths unspoken, alliances unacknowledged, and names written not in ledgers, but in blood. Let the record show, we found the ledger, but we did not find peace." S.H. I never published that account. Until now. It sat for years in a drawer in my study, long after Holmes retired to the Sussex Downs and I returned to medicine. But some stories deserve their end. Not for glory, but for warning. The crimson silk ledger is now ash or sealed in some vault where names grow fainter with time. But its truth remains, for those who care to read between the entries.